Okay, where are we up to? We we are examining how you could possibly say that experience is what's going on in the brain. Is. Not just correlated, but is identical to. And we are using the way in which science discovers identities, because science does discover identities. And we had two types. We had sound on the one hand, and water on the other hand. And the difference between them is this. In the case of sound, you have a large amount of data about what sound does, and you have no clue what sound is. None at all. Take all of what you know about what sound does. That's your functional description of sound. Might even call it a functional definition of sound. That's what you know about sound. If you find something that does all that stuff, then you have good reason to say that you've discovered sound, since the thing that you have found satisfies everything you know about sound. Water is different because in addition to functional information about water, we also have samples of water. So if I'm going to claim that water is really Q, I have two jobs to do. Show, first of all, that Q does all the things that water does, and also show that stuff that I have in my glass is Q. That's a separate project. That's because in the case of water, you have two types of data. You have information about what it does, and you also have samples. So you have these two different patterns, depending upon the kind of thing it is you're trying to discover. And as you use the word, which I used a couple of times yesterday, reduce, you're reducing this thing to other things that you know. Usually it's a reduction to something material. That's what we talk. Are we okay so far? Yeah. Okay, now, what pattern does the attempt to reduce experience to the brain follow? Is it like sound or is it like water? I think it's obvious that it's like water, because in the case of experience, we have a lot of functional information. That's quite right. We know what sorts of events cause experiences. We know what sorts of effects experiences have. That's functional description. But we also have loads and loads of examples of experience. We're having them all the time. So in the case of experience, you have to do a double job. You have to show that your candidate, which in this case is brain events, things that happen in the brain, your candidate performs the functions that you have learned that experience performs, and I said that could be done. That it's very plausible to think that the things that cause experiences and the effects that experiences have are mediated by the brain. We have the nervous system as transmitting impulses, and I have no complaint about that. But the second job, to take felt experience and to show that it's made out of neurons, that it has neurons as its parts, that it's just a collection of neurons and neurons operating, that I think is hopeless for a number of reasons. First of all, we said if you try to take an experience apart into its pieces, and you could do that. Experiences are complex, and they have pieces and dimensions, but each piece and each dimension is fully an experience. Not one of them is a piece of sand or a puff of cloud or some other physical thing. So when you take experiences apart, you don't seem to be getting closer to something physical. When you build up from the neurons, try to find experiences. The more neurons you have, the more physical stuff you have. But finding in the conglomeration of neurons a taste of chocolate or a toothache, there just doesn't seem to be any way to do that. We can't imagine what that would be like. Now, I was careful to tell you that what you can and cannot imagine doesn't always cut the ice. It doesn't always determine the outcome. But there are different kinds of cases. In the case of sound, when I said we couldn't imagine what it would be like to weigh a sound, that's because sound was blank. Okay. If it's really blank, somebody says, could you imagine weighing a sound? The answer is, weighing a what? All I know about sound is it behaves like a physical thing, but what kind of physical thing it is, I haven't got a clue. Can I imagine it? No, because the idea of sound is just a blank in my mind. It's a blank. Here it's not blank. Here we have a very good idea of what experience is. We're having experiences all the time. a very good idea of what the brain is because of the studies that have been done. And it's a question of marrying two ideas about which we have very considerable information and knowledge. If we draw a blank there, that blank is more important. Again, I wouldn't say by itself it wins the argument, but it's more important as an obstacle. Then we said, when you compare the concepts we use to describe experience and the concepts we use to describe physical objects, there are gaps between the types of concepts that they are. The concept of an experience has a point of view built in, what it is for the one who's having the experience. The concept of physical object doesn't have a point of view built in. There's nothing that it is being a table for. Being a table is just a table. So what are you trying to do? If you're trying to find experience in the brain, you're trying to take facts which have no point of view and build them, combine them, concatenate them, coordinate them to get something which does have a point of view. Again, maybe that's possible, but it sounds very peculiar because you've got two categorically different types of concepts here. Similarly, we said the concept of physical object is a concept of something whose identity is given by its structure. That's how we think about physical objects. When you talk about table, or you talk about water, or you talk about smoke, or you talk about black hole, the concept of the thing is it's built up out of pieces, and the pieces make it what it is. That's the way we think about physical objects. That's not the way we think about experiences. Experiences don't come with a whole, well, there's a structure, and the structure determines what it is. We don't think about them that way. So again, reducing experiences with no whole to a set of concepts with holes is something which looks like it's apples and oranges. Now, that's why people like Nagel say the only way to get around this is to have a conceptual revolution, where you can create a new set of concepts which aren't apples and oranges. Okay, fine. But if your position requires you to bet that there will be a conceptual revolution, I think the odds on your position go down drastically, because no one can predict when such a thing will happen. No one can predict even if such a thing is possible. If that's what you really need to make your position work, it's time to start thinking about alternatives. That was all we did yesterday. The last thing we did yesterday was Frank Jackson's argument, which I'll repeat. And we discussed all of this before we go on to the positive side, which is the other thing I'd like to do with you. Frank Jackson's argument were like this. We are considering the idea that there's only the brain. That's what the scientific world is trying to sell us. It's only the brain, nothing else. That means all facts about my experience are facts about the brain, because there's only the brain, there's nothing else. So, my taste of chocolate is just something going on in the brain, and my vision of blue is just something going on in the brain, and my decision to go on a diet is just something that's going on in the brain. All experience is just something that's going on in the brain. Well, even before I get back to the parable of Mary, if that's true, then someone who knows everything about what's going on in the brain must therefore know everything there is to know about experience, since there isn't anything else. I take it that's obvious. If there isn't anything else, someone who knows everything that's going on in the brain automatically knows everything there is to know about experience. Okay, so now Frank Jackson created this parable of Mary, the gifted neuroscientist who was born into and developed, grew up in a black, white, and gray environment with no color perception whatsoever. And she specializes in the visual system of the brain, starting with the retina. And she knows it cold. She knows all the facts about the visual system of the eye, optic nerve, and retina, and brain. All of them. If she knows all the facts about the physiology of sight, then she knows all there is to know about the experience of sight. Because experience is just what goes on in the brain. There isn't anything else. The brain is everything. It's the whole story. So now, the question is this. Suppose after she's mastered all of that and knows all of that, she's taken outside and she sees a rose, a red rose. Does she learn a new fact? And the intuition which many people share here is, of course she does. She now knows what red looks like. That she didn't know before. She didn't know what red looks like. And then Jackson, before he changed his mind, said, well, if she's learning a new fact, then apparently all of the information she had about the brain wasn't enough to give her all the facts about experience. If that's the case, then facts about experience aren't simply facts about the brain. They just aren't. That's Frank Jackson's argument. So all these arguments are conceptual arguments that the idea that the brain is everything is simply won't work. It simply won't work. Are we together so far? Yeah.
I don't want to rehash what I had yesterday, but I'll just say this. I feel like there's a difference between like knowing facts in the way like we would know like a line of a poem or know like a formula or something versus knowing what it's like to like take in like a breath of fresh air or knowing what it's like to be hot. I'm not saying that one doesn't happen in the brain or one like does, but it's not always like a conscious knowing like versus of like reading something. And so I don't see how the example of knowing all the facts about the brain could really like we could conceptualize what that is. Because then when we make the leap to if she goes out and steps outside and sees a red rose, in our minds of knowing all the facts, at least for me, I'm imagining it knowing like every single like detail, logistic piece of the brain that could ever happen, like the neurons, in all the different patterns, whatever.
That's right.
But to actually get the sensation, like you can't know that without, like.
So I don't see why you're not just repeating my argument and agreeing with it. You sound as if you're resisting my argument, but the words that you are saying sound to me like they confirm my argument. You are saying there's a world of difference between merely knowing all the neural transactions and all the cells going on and all the chemistry of the brain on the one hand, and knowing what an experience is like. If so, then knowing what an experience is like isn't. Knowing something about the brain, in which case knowing everything about the brain isn't knowing everything about experience, which means that the facts about experience aren't facts about the brain. That's my conclusion. It sounds like your words are confirming that.
Okay. I don't know if this is going to get any further. I recognize there's the distinction, but I just feel like in our conscious head, we can't understand like what it's like to know an experience. Like if you were to know all the facts.
Yeah.
Sorry, we can drop this and like.
I'd like just for you to consider your words. We don't know what? We don't know what an experience is? You're having one right now. You don't know what it is? What do you mean you don't know what it is?
No, like if you were to step outside, someone was to describe every single bit of an experience. They could say everything, but you're not going to know what it's like unless you were there.
Well, I don't think that's correct. How does a chef predict that how a new concoction will taste?
Well, that's all based off their experience.
Maybe so, but he hasn't been there. He's creating a new concoction, and he can predict exactly how it will taste. Beethoven, for the last half of his life, was deaf. He composed his late symphonies when he was deaf. How did he know how that symphony, the Eighth Symphony, was going to sound to people when he couldn't even hear the chords he was playing on the piano to write the symphony? That's not true that you have to be there to know how it's going to...
Don't you think having a basis of an experience? She had no idea what... Like, for someone who's blind, trying to describe a color, that's impossible.
Okay. Okay, but now, we weren't talking about words. We were talking about facts. She knows everything there is to know about the brain, and she learned something new, then this new thing that she learned isn't a fact about the brain.
No, the only thing that I had trouble with was the analogy. So the way we understand knowing all the facts, if we were to agree with that, it's almost like I disagree with like my intuition of saying when she sees the red rose, she's getting a new fact. But because like when we understand all the facts, you can't like in our world know what red is if you've never like experienced color. But if she knows all the facts that like how we experience facts, I'm getting like confused in my own wording. But
I think the wording is problematic here. Now you say you can't know what red is. It depends upon which red you're talking about. Red is a particular wavelength of light. You could know what that is without having experienced red. Colorblind people can do physiology of color perception. They can do it. They know that if you have this frequency of light and you shine on the retina, these cells will fire, those cells won't fire. It'll be carried up the optic nerve in a certain type of frequency, and so on and so on. They know what red color is. They just don't know what the experience of red color is. But red color is the wavelength of light that's reflected by red things. There's no difficulty in knowing that. You look it up in a book. You can test it on a machine. So if you're talking about knowing what red is, it depends on what you mean by knowing what red is. Indeed, how do colorblind people drive cars? How do they do that? They come to a stoplight. Well, I was taught the top one is red and the bottom one is green. And so I know when the top one is shining, stop. The bottom, and I can tell you, the red light was shining, the green light was, then the green light went on. Not that I can see the colors, but I've been taught that the top one is red and the bottom one is green. So doesn't he know the top one is red? Sure he does. He just doesn't know what it's like to experience red. And that's precisely the point of the argument. That's another type of fact. What it's like to experience red is a fact about the world. It happens to be a fact about my world, but I'm part of the world, and it's just as relevant a fact as any other fact. There's my weight, and my height, and my strength, and what kind of experiences I have. That's also part of the objective world. Right? I can even lie about it. I can say I see red when I'm seeing green. There's a fact about what experiences you have. The question is what kind of fact that is. Now, the scientific community tells us the fact about your experiences is a fact about the brain. And Frank Jackson's argument shows you that that's not going to wash, because you could know all the facts about the brain and still not know that fact about your experience. So then it's got to be a different kind of fact. Okay, let's leave it there. And if you can come up with a formulation of the problem that you're happy with, we can try it again. Question is now what to do. If experience isn't something that's just the brain, yes, I've changed the words a little bit. So how then do we deal with it? What do we say about it? Now, among the philosophers, there are three different ways to go. I'll tell you the simplest, and we'll deal with it to answer objections, because it happens to be our way. And our way is taken seriously today as one of the three, David Chalmers, the leaders in philosophy of mind, and a card-carrying atheist, says the idea of a separate thing, which is where experience takes place, is one of the three possibilities. We use the word soul. He doesn't use this word soul. God forbid. I mean, well, perish the thought, because he doesn't want to identify himself with the religious world. But there's a separate thing, and that's where experience is. And as we said at the beginning, what happens in that separate thing is correlated to what happens in the brain. It's correlated, but not identical. Two things correlated. One of the standard objections to this idea, when I was in graduate school 100 years ago, this was used to rule it out. Just rule it out. You talked about the soul 60 years ago, 50 years ago when I was in graduate school, they would just laugh you out of the room. It was not tolerated. Is the idea of an interaction between the brain and this other thing which isn't physical. How are they correlated? How do they keep track of one another? When you do something to the brain, then the soul responds a certain way. When you do something happens to the soul, and the brain and the body respond a certain way. How do you keep track of them? How do they keep track of one another? The natural thought is they interact. Interact? How do they interact? How can what's going on in a physical thing have any effect on this non-physical thing, the soul? How can what's going on in the soul have an effect on the physical thing? If they're really that different, if one is physical and the other isn't physical, then they're just totally detached from one another. Cause and effect is like you hit the cue ball, and the cue ball hits the 7 ball, and the 7 ball goes in the pocket. That's stick to ball to ball to pocket. Physical to physical to physical to physical. Maybe, depending upon how you thought about the soul, you could imagine, if you think about this, it makes you think about that, and so on and so on. But going in between soul and brain, how are you going to describe, how are you going to understand a connection between two things that are so different from one another? Richard Taylor wrote a book called Metaphysics, That was one of the chapters in the book, and that was just the end of it. And I told you, in the last 10 years, the whole subject resurrected because of the difficulties that we went through in the first couple of days. Now, there's an answer to this question, and I'm pleased with myself that I thought of it on my own, and then David Chalmers wrote it in a paper. He's a revolving genius, and he's one of the leaders in this whole field of philosophy, so I was very happy to see somebody else was using this idea. And the headline behind the idea is this. The person asking the question presents himself in the following way. Billiard balls? That's fine. We really understand that. The stick hits the ball hits another ball, the ball's in a pocket. We're comfortable with that. We understand that. That's familiar. We've got that. Soul, who knows what's going on in the soul? But to have a bridge between the soul and the brain, the soul and the body, that's utterly mysterious, unintelligible, beyond imagination, and you're just inventing a very difficult picture, a picture that has right in the core of it a very difficult feature. That's the way he presents himself. The answer that I want to suggest, based on the work of David Hume, is that we don't understand causality in the physical world either. We don't understand the billiard balls. We don't understand the billiard balls. And so putting the soul in isn't adding a new mystery. It's just spreading the old mystery. But the mystery is there, and it's the same mystery in both cases. The presentation that we understand the physical and introducing a non-physical creates a gap that we can't understand. That presentation is a mistake. In order to show you this, I have to give you a sketch of Hume's work on causality, which I will do for you. One of the most famous arguments in the last 300 years in all of philosophy. It's an argument which to this day hasn't been answered. Oh, there's a variety of views on it. I'm giving you one view, but it's one view that we could certainly use to make our position legitimate. So the stick hits the ball, and the ball hits the second ball, and the ball goes into the pocket. Intuitively, what you think when you see that is, well, the stick hit the ball, and that caused the ball to move. So really, intuitively, there are three things going on here. There's the stick hitting the ball, which is the cause. There's the ball moving, which is the effect. And the causing, pushing, forcing, necessitating between the stick hitting the ball and the ball moving, which means that it caused it. It wasn't just accidentally followed by it, it caused it. It's a certain relationship that makes it happen. To make this vivid, all this is well-known stuff, none of it's mine. To make this vivid, let's imagine that this is going on in London, and just as the stick hits the ball, Big Ben bongs the hour of 1. Bong! And the ball moves. And someone says, hey, did you notice that? The ball moved right after the bong. Just like it moved right after being hit by the stick. And we will all say, yeah, that's true, but the bong is an accident. The bong's just an accident. The bong didn't make it move. The stick made it move. And when we say that, according to this presentation that I'm going to attack, when we say that, what we're saying is, look, true, there was the bong and the move, but in the case of the bong and the move, there's only bong and move. In the case of the stick, there's the stick hitting, move, and forcing, pushing, causing, necessitating. There's an extra glue between the stick and the moving that there isn't between the bong and the moving. That's why we say that it's the stick that made it move, and we don't say the bong didn't make it move, because that extra relationship of forcing, necessitating, pushing isn't there between the bong and the move. Now, if this were reasonable, if what I just told you were reasonable, then the objection that we are talking about would be a reasonable objection. Because that would mean, in the physical world, I really understand it. When you put in the soul and the brain, then I don't understand it, and would be an extra terrible problem. Hume's argument is that Although you talk, you don't understand what you're saying with your talk. When you say, there's the stick hitting the ball, signing on. Good. There's the ball moving, I'm signing on. Good. And you say there's a third thing, the pushing, the causing, the forcing, the necessitating. At that point, Hume gets off the train and says, sorry. Sorry. I don't think you have any right to that. I don't think you know what you're talking about. I think you're using empty words. Empty words, which have no meaning, no description, no effect on the world. They're just empty. There really isn't any extra thing there called the causing, the pushing, the forcing, the necessitating. There's just the stick hitting the ball and the ball moving. That's all there is. Now, how does Hume argue this? Well, Hume has a picture of how we know things. And he says there are two ways to know things, and one is by observing the world, and the other is by using pure logic. Pure logic, mathematics, things that are dependent upon pure thought. Those are the two ways that we know things about the world. Of course, we use combinations. Let's try it out, says Hume. Let's try it out. Which way is the way that you get information, knowledge, about this third thing, the causing, the forcing, the necessitating? Where does that extra knowledge come from? Hume says, watch it. Watch it very carefully. Stick is approaching the ball. The stick hits the ball. The ball is starting to move. I see the motion of the stick. I see contact. I see the ball starting to move. Do I see anything else? Okay, take a digital video. 1,000 frames a second. Right? Run it very slowly. What are you going to see? You're going to see the stick approaching the ball very, very slowly. Then you're going to see contact. And then you're going to see the ball starting to move. All you're going to see is the motion of the stick and the motion of the ball. There's nothing else to see. It isn't as if at a certain point there's a sudden purple fuzz, which is the causing. There's nothing else there for your eye to observe. And if you held it with your hand or smelled it as it was going by, right, all you're going to get is two motions. You're getting the cause and the effect, and no third thing holding them together. So observation isn't going to do it. Pure logic certainly isn't going to do it. Imagine that you had never seen this game. The guy hits the ball with a stick and it's rolling towards the stick, or he's coming to hit the ball, and the stick is about to hit the ball. Predict what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen. Maybe the stick will just insert into the ball and it'll go nowhere. Maybe the ball will separate. If it's lead, it'll separate into two pieces of lead. Maybe it's like a balloon and it'll just pop. From pure logic, you can't predict what's going to happen. From experience, you don't see this third thing that joins them together. So, says Hume, your description of the third thing, the causing, the forcing, the necessitating, is just empty words. But back to the bong. Back to the bong. If that's true, how do we discriminate between the stick hitting in the ball and the ball moving, and we say the stick caused the ball to move, and the bong we say didn't cause the ball to move? What do we mean when we speak that way and discriminate the one from the other, if there isn't that third thing that's the causing in between with the stick and the ball? Answer, says Hume, what you're referring to is a long-term association that you're aware of. After all, Big Ben bongs all the time. And every time it bongs, nothing moves. So if this time the bong occurred just before the ball's moving, we say it's an accident because it's not regular. It's not regular for bongs to be followed by balls moving. Whereas in the case of the stick, almost every time you hit a ball with a stick, the ball moves. So you are used to the regularity of the stick and the ball, and you're used to the fact that the bong and the ball are not a regularity. And that's what you mean when you talk about causation. You're talking about what's regular and what isn't regular. Just a philosophical hint here. The hint here is, you want to see what's different between the stick and the ball and the bong and the ball? Don't look further inside. Don't look further inside for some subtle element that's in between that you haven't found. Look outside. Look to other cases that are similar. Look for patterns. And that's what makes the difference in this case. Difference in this case is not found inside this case. The difference in this case is found with the patterns that are relevant to it outside. We say the stick caused the ball to move because, in our experience, sticks hitting balls are followed by ball motions very regularly. We say the bong didn't cause it to move because, in our experience, bongs and balls moving is not a regularity that we experience. On the contrary, so Big Ben bongs all the time, and the balls sit there and don't do anything. So in this case, where the bong was just before the ball moving, we say that's an accident because, in our experience, this almost never happens. Which means, according to Hume, when you talk about causation, all you have is regularity. It's what happens all the time, almost all the time. When you say A causes B, what you're saying is, I've had vast experience of things similar to A, similar to B, and I know that every time something similar to A happens, something similar to B happens. It's just a regularity. Now, if that's all causation is, and this is one of the many views on causation, if that's all the causation is, then it seems to me introducing the soul causes no special problem, no extra problem. Every one of us has vast regularities between what happens in the body and what happens in the soul. Almost every time, for hundreds of thousands of times that I've decided to raise my hand goes up. The decision is an event in the soul, and the hand follows suit and goes up. Almost every time somebody steps on my foot, I feel a pain. That's regularity that's vast in its application. So I say, I have exactly the same for the interaction between the soul and the body as I have for the billiard table. All I have for the billiard table is regularity. And I have vast experienced regularity between what happens in my experience and what happens in my body. And that being the case, I have just as much information about causation for soul and body as I have for the physical world. There's no extra problem here. Yeah.
Do you think there's any more to it besides regularity, or by understanding the processes at play?
I can tell you this: for every question in philosophy, there are 5 answers, and for every answer, there are 10 objections. Philosophy is a mess. It's really a mess. If you want to get a taste of it, you can go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy online and look up any subject. And they're very well organized articles, and they're written by the best people in the field. And if you look up causation, you'll see there are 5 major theories of causation. And here are the difficulties with each of the 5 theories. It's a mess. So what I do when I make connections to philosophy, all I do is this. I say, the Jewish picture has a certain idea. Is it ruled out by philosophy? Ruled out as unacceptable? No, because there's a strand of philosophy that agrees with it. So it's not ruled out. Does that mean that it's necessarily right? Well, philosophy is in such confusion that you can't determine what's really right, but it isn't ruled out. If the whole of the philosophical community were unanimously against it, even though they change over time, but if they were unanimously against it, then I would feel there was some pressure. If I can find at least one respectable strand in the philosophical literature that's in favor of what we're talking about, then I think no complaints can be raised against us. So you ask me what I think? This is a specialist's field. I don't have any thoughts of my own on what causality really is. It's just very, very difficult.
I was just thinking the process between a ball hitting another ball and how that action and reaction goes into it. Understanding the physics and the laws going on, it makes sense to say that causes this. But incorporating a soul, it's hard for us to really know what processes are going on.
Okay, let's try this. I mean, you say it makes sense to say. I want to argue that when you say it makes sense to say, in the end, all you end up with is regularities. That's all you've got. And the picture you have in your mind is a picture that is, I think, in a certain way, misleading. I'll try to show you that. Let me take a different example because the scientific trail is easier to show with simpler science. Rabbi has an article about this. I've asked some people who knew him, is it possible that he read Hume? Because Rabbi argument is very similar to Hume's argument. They said he probably didn't read it, but he taught college students, and maybe some of the college students shared it with him. Rabbi imagines we ask someone, why does grass grow? So he says, everybody knows that. Put the seed in the ground, and you water it, apply sunlight at a reasonable temperature, and grass grows. So Rabbi says, I'm not sure you understood my question. You told me when it grows. You told me under what conditions it grows. That wasn't what I was asking. I was asking, why does it grow? What makes it grow? Oh, you'll be told. Well, you have to understand. The roots have very little tentacles that go out into the soil. And the roots absorb moisture and particles of soil. And those are passed up the tubes in the plant, and the cells receive their nutrients from there, and then the cells, when they have enough nutrients, grow bigger, and then they divide. So it tells you the whole story. Now it does. It says, okay, what have you done? You've given me a lot more information about what happens. You've given me a much longer and detailed description of what happens. The roots have tentacles, and they absorb the water, and the water goes up, and it's absorbed into the cell, and the cell gets bigger. You've given me a much more detailed description of what's happening. But my question is, why is it happening? What's making it happening? So the answer you get is, well, I understand you, but that means you have to go into more detail. The cell is made of molecules. Trillions of molecules. And the molecules interact with one another in various ways. This one combines with this one takes this one apart, and this one goes to pieces, and this one's reassembled. And it's a very complicated process. So it does this is, aren't you just giving me more of the same? You're telling me that on the molecular level, these are the things that happen. But I wasn't asking for more description of what happens. I was asking you why it happens. What makes it happen? I said, well, okay, listen, we can go down to the elements. The elements are the elementary particles, whatever they are, right? Okay, tell me about them, those elementary particles. Well, for example, let's take electrons. Now, electrons are negatively charged, so when you try to push them together, it gets harder and harder. They repel one another, and they have a certain spin and so forth and so on. So when you bounce something off them, they go off at an angle, and they have a certain mass, so when you try to push them, aren't you just giving me more information about what they do? Isn't it just more description of what's happening? When you go down levels, all you get is more description of what's happening. I don't mean to belittle this. All this information is useful. If you know what happens, then you know what to anticipate. You might know what to change in order that things should work out differently in the end. But all you're getting is more information of the same kind. The information is always what happens. Which means the answer to Rav Desta's question at the outset, what makes it happen, you get no answer. You just get more and more information about what happens. They ask a physicist, why do electrons repel one another? Answer is, they just do. We see that they do, and they do. No explanation why they do that, what makes them do that. That's the smallest stuff, and that's what it does. Everything else is built out of that. That's all you get. So in the end, going down the scientific lane all the way to the bottom, you don't get an answer to what makes it happen. All you get is a more and more description of what happens. Now, if you say this makes it reasonable to say A causes B, I'm happy with that. It means when you've got enough information about what happens, you're happy to call that causation. Fine. I think I have just as much information about how the soul and the body interact. I have information about what happens. I know that almost every time I decide to raise my hand goes up. That's what happens. That's as reliable as electrons. So, if the regularities described by the scientific world make you comfortable with saying that you have causation, it seems to me that the regularities that we experience between our own, what goes on in experience, what goes on in the body, should be just as comfortable with the idea of causation there, because in the end, all you have is regularities. You don't have anything else. If you had something qualitatively different in the physical world, then we'd be in a different situation. Then you say, in the physical world, we got Q, and for the soul of the body, we don't have Q, and that means the soul of the body is different, and it's something which is more problematic, and so forth and so on. But you don't have a Q for the physical world. All you have in the physical world is correlations. That's all you got. Then wherever you have correlations, you ought to be equally happy to say that you have causation. That's a way to defend against that objection. Okay? We're together? So the picture that we have is that there's a body, there's a soul, and they are correlated with one another, and you could even say that they are causally interacting with one another. You could say that. Now, this answer is only on the open philosophical table. From our point of view, God is running the world. I don't need to talk about causation. God's running the world, and He can make the correlation work on His own. And indeed, there were philosophers who said that 200 years ago, Leibniz for one. But if I'm arguing with somebody on philosophical grounds, then that's the way to argue. That idea that they interact with one another is not an impossible problem. So we are dualists. Human being is composed of two elements, soul and body, and they interact with one another. And here, I'm going to make one more point, which I'm going to take a few minutes to make, but I think this is very important to keep this in mind. Human being is composed of soul and body. Human being is not a soul riding around on a body. And maybe at the end of the trip, the body gets discarded, and the soul just enjoys the new view. No, human being is the soul and the body. The body is as essential to the human being as the soul is. That's why, after death, when there is a separation of the soul and the body, there has to be a resurrection. Because a soul is not a human being. A soul is a piece of a human being. Soul is not human. Only a soul and body together are human. That's why, according to almost everyone, Adam was created to be immortal. There was no death. Death was a result of eating from the tree of knowledge. That was introduced by human failure. And that means that Adam, had he succeeded in the challenge of the Garden of Eden, would have gone into Olam Haba, the next world, with body, soul and body together. Because it's the human being for whom the universe was created, and it's a human being for whom the future is intended. The whole human being, not a piece of the human being. So resurrection for us is an absolute necessity. There is a parable in the Talmud. Very often these parables are the Talmud's way of making philosophical points without advertising the fact. The parable goes like this. There was a fellow who owned an orchard, and he noticed that some of his fruits were missing. And he saw two people, and he suspected them, and he accused them of stealing from the orchard. And they said to him, you're making a mistake. Take a better look at us. One of us is a cripple, he can't walk, so obviously he didn't steal from the orchard. And the other one is blind. He couldn't steal from the orchard, so you're making a mistake. The owner of the orchard said, you can't fool me. The blind one picked up the cripple on his shoulders, and the cripple who could see told the blind one where to walk, and that's how you stole the fruit from my orchard. And that's the parable. What's it a parable of? It's a parable of the soul and the body in this world. After a lifetime, if God says to the soul, why did you rebel against me? The soul will say, I only love the true, the good, the beautiful, the right, the dutiful, the holy. Me? I didn't rebel against you. God comes to the body and says, why did you rebel against me? The body says, I have no executive powers. I can't make any decisions. I can't rebel or follow either. Right? So God says, so to speak, you can't fool me. It's the two of you together. It's soul and body together that are capable of free will. This is absolutely essential to all Jewish thought. And that's why a human being is made out of two elements. No other entity in God's creation is made out of two separate entities together. Because only the human being is supposed to exercise free will. So, that being the case, when there's punishment for failure, it ought to apply to the agent who performed the act. And the agent was soul plus body. So then the punishment has to apply to soul plus body. And if there's reward, the reward ought to apply to the agent that performed the act. And the agent that performed the act is soul plus body. So then the reward has to be experienced by soul plus body. That's the Talmudic logic in this case. That's why resurrection is absolutely necessary as a prelude to going to the world to come, soul together with body. Now, of course, transformations take place. They go through different stages and so on and so on. But the idea of leaving the body behind altogether and your identity being the identity of a soul only is something which almost everyone rejects. Maimonides accepts it, but I think everyone else was against him in that regard. In the last 500 years, I don't think anybody took Maimonides' position. So from the point of view of our tradition that we're dealing with, it's soul plus body. And that's why the existence of the soul is so important for us, because it's the soul and the body together make up the human being, the identity of the human being. Okay, yeah.
You said that when you make a decision to raise your hand, every time you say you raise your hand, so that shows that the soul will have an effect on the body. Is there evidence for the other way when you move the love with the body, or the body also has an effect on the
Sure,
soul?
somebody steps on my foot and I feel a pain. Feeling pain is definitely a...
The correlation works both ways?
Sure, works both ways. It's very important that it should work both ways. Absolutely. Take a more let's say, prosaic example. Someone talks to me, and I change my mind. Talking to me is his physical effect on me. The airwaves hit my eardrums, and the eardrums set up impulses in my brain, and the result of it is I have a change in plan. Change in plan is something that goes on in the soul as a result of the fact that he influenced me physically in a certain way. That's what talk is. So our experience of the correlation between soul and body is vast, vast, vast. Much greater than my experience of billiard balls. And that being the case, if it's just the correlations, the regularities that ground the judgment of causality, we have nothing to be embarrassed about in terms of causality between the soul and the body. Okay?